My son used my surgery fund to take his 1 week girlfriend to the Bahamas. 1 hour before takeoff, I froze his. Grace Whitaker stood in her sunny kitchen, the late morning light streaming through gingham curtains and catching the edge of a single sheet of paper pinned to the refrigerator. The magnet holding it in place was turquoise and white, shaped like a breathing lung, and bore the simple word breathe. She pressed a hand to her chest and inhaled deeply, just as the magnet advised. For 9 long months, she'd waited for this moment, the moment when the final pre-surgery paperwork would be completed, when every yes box would be checked. She slid the file out from behind the magnet and smoothed the top page, Benton County Orthopedic Center, patient Grace E. Whitaker, procedure left hip replacement, date August 12, 2024, time 7:30 a.m. Her stomach fluttered. She'd gone through every form with a fine-tooth comb last night. The consent forms, the allergy questionnaires, the pre-op instructions. They'd confirmed her blood type, tested her EKG, even scheduled the pre-op physical with Dr. Nguyen. Today, the final step, she needed to sign a release from her financial planner, verifying that her post-surgery fund was set aside and untouchable. Grace closed her eyes, imagining the relief of waking in recovery, the dull ache of a new hip in place of the sharp, grinding pain she'd endured for 2 years. The agony had started as a mild discomfort on early morning walks around Maplewood Village Pond, a twinge in her hip joint that she chalked up to age, but it had progressed quickly, each step more painful than the last, until she found herself leaning heavily on the kitchen counter just to shuffle across the room. She placed the paper back on the fridge, double-checking the magnet's hold. Below it, her daughter's childhood drawings, rainbows in crayon, a stick figure family under a heart, fluttered slightly in the morning breeze. Grace's gaze lingered on a sketch of their front porch, two stick figures and a dog under a bright yellow sun. She remembered how she carried her daughter to that porch swing when she scraped her knee at 4, how she and her husband Mark shared coffee there each spring morning. Mark. He would be with her every step of the way. He'd taken off work for the surgery, arranged for their neighbor, Mrs. Philbrook, to dog sit and stock the freezer with soup and mac and cheese. Gardenia bushes blossomed at the edge of the yard, just outside the kitchen window. When the scent wafted in, Grace felt a memory of their first home, wood-floored and full of promise. Before today, she'd thought recovering from hip replacement would be straightforward: surgery, rest, physical therapy, and back to life. But rural Maplewood's limited resources worried her. The nearest physical therapy clinic was a 20-minute drive, and Dr. Nguyen warned of potential complications in smaller towns with stretched-thin medical staff. She'd formed a fund with her financial planner, earmarking every extra dollar, tax return, birthday gifts, assorted bonuses into a separate account labeled Grace's New Hip. Today, she'd lock it down with the release. Grace took one more slow breath, then turned to rally herself. She would sign the release, drop it at the planner's office on Main Street, and call her daughter to celebrate. Then, when the call came that she was checked in for surgery, she'd grip Mark's hand and breathe again, this time into a future not defined by pain, but by possibility. She pressed her palm to the refrigerator, thumb brushing the magnet's encouraging word. "Breathe," she whispered. "We're ready." Grace's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter just as she was sliding on her shoes to head out the door. She glanced at the caller ID, Trevor Whitaker. Her son's name lit up the screen in bold letters. "Hey, Mom!" Trevor's voice exploded through the speaker, his usual calm tone was replaced by something more manic. "Good morning, honey," Grace said, fastening her laces. "What's going on?" "Mom, you are not going to believe this," Trevor shouted, and she could practically see his grin through the line. "Kayla and I just booked it. Bahamas, baby." Grace's hand froze on her sneaker. She pictured her teenage son, knees knocking, grinning at the prospect of turquoise water and all-you-can-eat buffets. "The Bahamas," she repeated, carefully modulating her tone. "Yep," Trevor declared. "All-inclusive resort, flights booked for next Tuesday. We leave at—" He stumbled over the details in his excitement. "We leave in 1 week, 7 days. Mom, I'm telling you, snorkeling, beach bars, midnight beach walks. Kayla's never seen the ocean." Grace blinked. Kayla, his girlfriend of 1 week. A whirlwind romance that bloomed at the start of summer with late-night texts and a single picture of a sun-kissed beach. "Now that's great, Trevor," Grace said slowly, standing in the middle of her kitchen. She forced a lightness into her voice she didn't feel. "How did you manage to pay for all of that?" A beat of silence. Then Trevor laughed, a nervous bark. "Oh, credit cards. Little help from a fund." Grace's heart dropped. She clenched the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Fund?" she echoed. "Yeah, Mom," Trevor began, but even in his excitement, she heard the hesitation. "Trevor, did you tap into my surgery account?" Grace's voice rose higher than she intended. Her hip, already throbbing from arthritis, felt suddenly hollow. "Oh, well," Trevor stammered, "it was in your folder on the fridge. I mean, you wouldn't miss 50% of it, right?" Grace closed her eyes, fighting for composure. He had used her money, the money she'd been pinching pennies to save for her hip replacement, to fund a 1 week fling in the Bahamas. "Trevor Whitaker," she said, voice trembling yet firm, "we are going to talk about this when you get home." She ended the call and stared at the phone, imagining sparkling Caribbean waves lapping white sand, paid for by her own impending surgery. In that moment, the breathe magnet on the fridge felt like a cruel joke. Grace set her chin, steeling herself. She would confront him. She would protect her surgery fund by any means necessary, because no grand tropical getaway, no matter how glamorous, was worth sacrificing her health or well-being. With a deep, determined breath, she pulled the hip surgery folder from the fridge and tucked it under her arm. Today, she would fight for her future, $1 at a time. Grace stood at the kitchen island, the hip surgery folder now resting unopened beside her coffee mug. She looked across the counter at Trevor, who shifted his weight from one foot to the other as he met her gaze. "Trevor," she said quietly but firmly, "I need to know, where did you get the money for this trip?" He rubbed the back of his neck, eyes flicking to the tile floor. "Mom, She held up a hand. "Don't, Mom, just tell me." He took a breath. "I use that health card you keep in the bottom drawer." That card, an obscure prepaid medical debit card, was strictly tied to her surgery fund account, intended for copays, prescriptions, and post-op therapy. Grace's throat tightened. "You mean," she said, voice sharp, "you charge nearly $5,000 to my surgery fund?" Trevor winced. It was more like $4,750 after taxes and fees. He glanced down, eyes brimming with guilt. "I'm sorry, Mom, but you always said, if you ever really need it, just say the word." Grace's heart hammered. She remembered that conversation years ago when she'd had to lay herself open about finances, when she told him that the fund wasn't just his fallback. "I said if you really needed it," she repeated slowly. "Needing it means a medical emergency, not a 1 week vacation." Trevor's head snapped up. "But it was an emergency." She blinked. "An emergency?" He ran a hand through his hair. Kayla needed a break, Mom. She's been stressed. Her dad lost his job. She's saving for college. I couldn't let her miss summer before senior year. Grace felt the room shrink around her. She reached into her drawer and pulled out the plastic card, its numbers faint on the worn surface. You consider that an emergency? He hesitated, voice cracking. I I panicked. I saw the card and thought you'd understand. Grace clutched the card as though it burned her palm. All the nights she'd lain awake, imagining recovery, physical therapy, envisioning a future without pain, had been banked on that exact resource. She swallowed hard, forcing her voice to stay steady. Trevor, she said, your trip to the Bahamas was a choice, my surgery is not. She placed the card on the counter with deliberate care. This money is for my health, your health in 30 years. You can pay me back, but it won't undo the risk you took. Trevor's shoulders slumped. I'll pay you back, Mom. I promise. I'll work extra shifts, sell my bike, whatever it takes. Grace closed her eyes, gathering herself. She opened her drawer again, lifted the surgery fund folder, and slid it onto the counter. We'll figure it out, she said softly. In that silent kitchen, with the hip surgery folder splayed open between them, Grace realized that boundaries, or lack thereof, could cost more than money. Let's be clear, she said at last, tone firm but loving. My health fund is off limits, understood. Trevor nodded, tears pricking his eyes. Understood. Grace reached out and pressed a hand to his cheek. I love you, Trevor, but I'm choosing myself now. And with that, she closed the drawer on his excuses and on the card that jeopardized her chance to walk again. Grace hung up the phone with a soft click that echoed through her quiet kitchen. The receiver slipped from her trembling hand, and she pressed it back into its cradle without meeting Trevor's pleading gaze. She stood motionless for a moment, staring at the surgery fund folder on the counter. It felt like a stone now, solid, weighty, and impossibly out of reach. Each receipt and deposit had been earned with careful sacrifice over 14 long months. She recalled declining dinner invitations, brewing her own tea instead of splurging on coffee shop lattes, and wearing that thin spring jacket well into winter because she refused to spend money on a new coat. Every penny she saved carried a promise. One day she would use it to heal. But in less time than it takes to pack a suitcase, her promise had vanished, burned away by plane tickets and beachfront cocktails for a 7-day fling. Grace lifted a hand to her chest and pressed her palm against her sternum, as if trying to physically lift the weight. It felt lodged there, a brick of betrayal and heartbreak. She could almost feel Trevor's laughter echoing in her ribcage, the carefree urgency of his voice still ringing in her ears. Bahamas, baby. Her breathing hitched. The magnet on the fridge, breathe, mocked her with its gentle reminder. She closed her eyes and forced herself to draw in a slow, steady breath, counting to 5 as the air filled her lungs, then exhaling all the tension on another count to 5. Visions of the past 2 years flashed unbidden. Her freezing winter morning, walks to the bank to deposit another $100 into the fund. Her daughter's surprise 41st birthday party, where friends pooled together a small gift so Grace wouldn't dip into her savings. Her husband Mark's proud smile when she finally reached halfway to her goal. She had given up movie nights and new books, and even the Christmas ski trip she'd promised herself after surgery. Now, all of that discipline, all of that deferred pleasure, had been squandered on a love not yet old enough to buy her a coffee. Grace opened her eyes and looked at the folder again. The edges of the medical forms seemed to blur. Her reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator door looked tired, eyes hollowed by worry, shoulders stooped by the weight of her own broken trust. She reached out and lifted the folder firmly, her fingers closing around the cold metal clip. This time, she would not let the loss crush her. She would fight to recover every cent, every ounce of dignity she had poured into that account. If Trevor wouldn't respect her sacrifice, she'd take the steps to protect it herself. Closing her eyes once more, she whispered, "For my future and mine alone." And with that vow, Grace marched from the kitchen, her chest still heavy, but her will rekindled. Late afternoon light slanted through the living room windows of Grace's modest Maplewood bungalow. Trevor sprawled on her plaid couch, one foot propped on the coffee table, remote in hand, eyes glued to a rerun of his favorite sitcom. His laughter punctuated the room every few minutes, entirely at ease, as if the world hadn't shifted beneath his feet just hours ago. In the adjoining kitchen, Grace stood before the stove, a small saucepan of water coming to a rapid boil. Steam curled up around her trembling hands as she held a spatula over the flickering flame. She'd promised Trevor pasta, his comfort food of choice, and tonight she would deliver. But each time she tried to stir the water, her grip slipped. "Careful," came a gentle voice behind her. Frank, her husband of 37 years, leaned in the doorway. He rubbed his thumb across his rugged chin, concern etched into the lines around his eyes. He'd come home early from the clinic where he taught biology classes, sensing the tension in the house. Grace swallowed the lump in her throat. "I'm fine," she whispered, voice low. Frank crossed to her side. "Your hands are shaking." He placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Talk to me." She closed her eyes for a moment and took a shuddering breath, letting the steam clear her head. The pasta packet lay unopened on the counter. "Not yet," she whispered back. "Just give me a minute." Frank squeezed her shoulder and stepped away, understanding she needed to collect herself. Grace adjusted the spatula, her knuckles white, and nudged the water around to keep it from boiling over. With every swirl, she counted 1, 2, 3, willing her hands to find calm. Trevor's laughter drifted through the open doorway. Grace forced a fragile smile. She lifted the spatula like a lifeline, then steadied it with her free hand. The steam stung her eyes. She blinked rapidly. "Mom?" Trevor called, appearing at the threshold with a hopeful grin. "Is dinner almost ready?" Grace took a final steadying breath and let the spatula click into the saucepan. "Almost," she said quietly, voice firm at last. She turned away from the stove and reached for 2 deep plates. In the living room, Frank settled beside Trevor, offering him a gentle nod of reassurance. Trevor noticed his father's solemn expression and frowned. "What's going on?" Frank shook his head. "Nothing you need to worry about right now." Grace carried the bowls of steaming pasta back to the living room. Trevor leapt up. "Thanks, Mom." He plopped down and dug in immediately, as if oblivious to the tremor in her hands. She watched him eat, heart heavy but resolved. This would be the last time she served him dinner, as if everything were normal. Tomorrow she would demand answers, reclaim what was rightfully hers. For now, she would boil one last pot for the boy she loved, her son, lounging in his comfort zone, before she pulled the kitchen rug out from under him. After dinner, Grace excused herself and walked into the bathroom, closing the door softly behind her. The single overhead bulb cast a stark glow, illuminating every line on her face. She stood before the vanity mirror, towel still pinned at her chest, and studied her reflection. Her skin was paler than it had been a year ago, almost translucent. The fine lines around her eyes, once laugh lines from decades of family jokes, now spoke of worry and sleepless nights. Her shoulders stooped forward, an echo of the pain she carried in her hip joint. Grace leaned forward, resting her hands on the sink's cool porcelain. "Do they even see me anymore?" she whispered, voice thick with hurt. She thought of Trevor's carefree presence in her home, his phone calls, his laughter, his assumption that her finances existed for his convenience. He had treated her as a resource: free meals, free laundry, free babysitting for his 3-year-old niece on play dates. She was the dependable backup plan, the safety net no one bothered to untangle. In the mirror, she barely recognized the woman before her, not the vibrant mother who baked brownies for school fundraisers or taught neighborhood kids to ride bikes, not the caring nurse who'd tended to her own mother through cancer, just a pale outline bending under the weight of others' needs. Grace closed her eyes, searching inward for the spark that once lit her from within. The inexhaustible patience she once wore like a badge felt threadbare now. She forced a slow inhale, willing herself to remember that beneath the rubber gloves and practical aprons, she was more than a caretaker. She was a human being with her own needs, her own future. She opened her eyes, lifting her chin. A mask of calm settled onto her face as she turned on the faucet and splashed cold water against her cheeks. Each droplet felt like an awakening jolt. "Not tonight," she told her reflection. She grabbed a washcloth and patted her face dry. Then she reached for her robe, a soft cotton wrap in a cheerful robin's egg blue, and slipped it on. Standing tall, she stared into the mirror one more time. This time, she saw determination behind those tired eyes. The mask would stay in place for Trevor's sake tomorrow, would keep him believing everything was normal. But behind it, Grace resolved to reclaim her worth. She turned off the light and walked out of the bathroom. In the dim hallway, her silhouette stretched long and steady. She was more than a host, more than a backup plan. She was Grace Whitaker, and she would no longer be invisible. At 2:15 a.m., the world outside was hushed under a cobalt October sky. Grace sat alone at her kitchen table, the overhead light haloing her silver hair. Steam from the now cold pasta sat wicked on her plate. Her husband's left-behind mug of tea steamed quietly beside her. On the laptop before her, the login screen for her online bank and portal glowed. She'd enabled Remember Me months ago. One click always brought her straight to her accounts. Tonight, she needed that convenience. Her fingers hovered over the trackpad. Heart hammering, she clicked the saved bookmark labeled Medical Fund. The page loaded, displaying her surgery savings and the linked debit card. The 4-digit suffix, 4812, felt like 4 stakes driven into her chest. She minimized that window and opened the forwarded email from Trevor. Subject, Bahamas booking. Confirmation amount charged $4,785.20. Card ending. 12 notes. Kayla's birthday getaway. Grace exhaled slowly. She clicked freeze card on the bank-in interface. A red banner appeared. Your card, ending in 4812, is now temporarily suspended. No further transactions will be authorized. She stared at those words as if they were a life raft in a dark sea. Her chest loosened. The brick she'd carried these past hours shifted and cracked. She pressed her palms to her temples, then lowered them to her lap, feeling the tension drain away. Finally, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, fully, without apology. The air filled her lungs like forgiveness, exhaled her fear and frustration. Grace glanced once at the clock, 2:17 a.m., and then at the laptop screen. No more purchases, no more false promises. She had acted to protect her health and dignity. She closed her eyes and leaned back, resting her head against the chair. Outside, a lone car passed by, its tires humming on the asphalt. Inside, her kitchen was still, sanctuary restored. In the quiet of that early hour, Grace realized that reclaiming her surgery fund wasn't just about money. It was about breathing life back into herself, about choosing her well-being over everyone else's demands. She reached for her teacup, warmed it between both hands, and sipped. The tea was bitter and strong, just like the lesson she'd learned. One more deep breath, and Grace Whitaker felt whole again. At 5:42 a.m., the shrill ring of Grace's phone jolted her awake. She blinked against the kitchen's fluorescent glare, rubbing sleep from her eyes as she answered. Mom, they won't let us board. Trevor's voice was raw with panic. Behind him, muffled sobs. Kayla's tears echoed through the line. Grace rose from her chair, smoothing her blue robe. She glanced at the clock. 5:42. The airport's first shuttles would have just left home. She steeled herself. Trevor, she said, voice calm and measured. What happened? His words tumbled out. The airline blocked our tickets. The card was declined. He choked back a sob. We're stuck in Logan. Kayla's losing it. She's crying, Mom. Grace stood in the silent kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator loud in the background. She took a slow breath, then let it go. Medical funds don't cover beach getaways, she said, each word deliberate. There was a stuttered pause, like Trevor's mouth opening and closing underwater. But, Mom, no, Trevor, Grace interrupted. You used my surgery card for this. I warned you. But you always said, Trevor began, voice cracking. I said if it was a medical emergency, Grace corrected him softly. Not a vacation. You had other options. Trevor's voice fell to a strangled whisper. We're stranded. Grace nodded, though he couldn't see her. I won't reverse the freeze. You'll need to work out other arrangements. Tears trembled through Trevor's words. Kayla's crying. She's so embarrassed. Grace closed her eyes, picturing Kayla's tear-streaked face at the airport. She felt a stab of regret for the humiliation, for the wasted money, but she stood firm. Then call your father, Grace said quietly, or your credit card, but not my fund. Trevor's sigh was nearly inaudible. Okay. Grace laid the phone on the counter. She watched the screen go dark, then exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. In the early dawn hush, she pressed her palm to her chest. The brick of betrayal had cracked away a little more. She poured herself a cup of coffee, strong, black, and sipped. Outside, the sky was starting to pale into pink. Grace stood at the sink, feeling both stern and oddly at peace. Her voice, left hanging in the silent kitchen, was the last word Trevor would hear before facing the consequences of his choices. No rescue, no reprieve, only the wisdom of boundaries laid down in the soft light of morning. Later that night, the front door of the Whitaker residence banged open so hard the walls shuddered. Trevor stomped inside, slamming the door behind him with enough force to jolt the family portrait on the hallway wall. Jenna followed, arms folded and eyes red from crying. Unbelievable! Trevor yelled, pacing the length of the narrow living room. She froze the card without a word. Jenna kicked off her shoes by the sofa. What are we supposed to do now? In the kitchen, Grace stood at the counter, methodically filling the kettle. She moved with calm efficiency, no trembling hands this time. The soft click of the kettle's lid replaced the thunder of slammed doors. Frank slipped behind the sofa, kneeling beside Trevor. He laid a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. Trevor shrugged it off, agitated. They left us high and dry, Trevor spat. I'm supposed to get on a plane tomorrow for a beach resort, and now we're stuck. Jenna crossed her arms again. You used her health fund. It was your choice. Exactly, Frank said quietly. Choices have consequences. Trevor's pacing brought him within earshot of the kitchen. He leaned against the door frame, glaring at Grace. "You couldn't even talk to me?" Grace poured hot water into 2 tea mugs and set them on the counter. The steam curled like a silent rebuke. She offered one to Frank, who accepted with a nod. The other she held in both hands, wrapped in her palms. Trevor stared at the cups. "Where's dinner?" Grace didn't answer. She turned and walked to the living room, placing the mug on the coffee table. No apology, no furious retort, just the low hum of the refrigerator behind her. Frank settled on the sofa beside the tea, watching Trevor's fury collapse into frustrated exhaustion. Jenna sank onto the armchair, wiping at her eyes. Grace joined them, standing quietly in the soft lamplight. She folded her hands in front of her, her expression serene yet unyielding. The unspoken message hung in the air. Tonight there would be no dinner conversation, no negotiating, no erasing of boundaries. Trevor slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. Jenna stared at the floor. Only the kettle's faint echoing ring cut the silence as it clicked off automatically. Frank picked up his mug and took a careful sip. Grace followed suit, the tea's warmth grounding her. She took one measured sip and turned away. No shouting, no begging, no apology. In the stillness of the silent house, Grace's quiet resolve spoke louder than any argument could. The next morning dawned gray and chilly. Kayla arrived at the front porch of the Whitaker home with her wheeled suitcase and a duffel bag slung over her shoulder. Her eyes were puffy, mascara stained her cheeks. "Trevor," she snapped once she spotted him sitting on the bottom step, head tilted forward, hands clasped between his knees. His dark hair fell into his eyes. He didn't look up. Kayla slammed her bags down and glared at the house. "Your mom's crazy," she muttered, voice low enough for only Trevor to hear. But he didn't respond. He stayed perfectly still, like a statue carved of silent disappointment. She leaned into his space, brushing his shoulder with her sleeve. "Seriously, she freezes my card. Does this every time she's angry?" Trevor's shoulders didn't move. His silence spoke louder than any answer. Kayla stomped off the porch toward the sidewalk, dragging her bags behind her. The wheels clattered on the concrete, echoing in the empty street. Trevor watched her go, eyes unfocused, then turned his gaze back toward the darkened doorway behind him, toward the house that had been his refuge until last week. Inside, Grace stirred at the kitchen window, peering out with her arms crossed. She saw Kayla on the curb, tapping her foot, waiting for a taxi that would take her back to Boston. She saw Trevor unchanged, grounded in the consequences she'd enforced. Kayla yanked hard on the taxi door when it arrived, pulling herself inside. The driver nodded once, slammed the door, and steered off down Maplewood's sleepy street. Trevor rose as the taillights vanished, leaving only his foot-printed porch step and the whisper of the wind. He sank into the swing chair beneath the overhang and wrapped his arms around himself. Inside the kitchen, Grace let the kettle boil dry, its auto shut-off clicking softly, then turned away without pouring herself another cup. She didn't gloat or gloat or gloat. She just returned to her place at the table, opening her laptop to review her new post-operative schedule. In the silent house, Trevor sat longer than Kayla ever would have waited, for the first time truly contemplating his own recklessness. The porch swing creaked as he rocked, alone with his regret, and somewhere inside, Grace Whitaker exhaled a quiet sigh. That afternoon, Grace's phone buzzed with an email notification. She closed her financial planning portal and tapped the screen, bracing herself. The subject line read, Benton County Orthopedics, Surgery Confirmation. She opened the message. The text was clinical and concise. Dear Ms. Whitaker, your left hip replacement surgery has been rescheduled for August 26th at 7:30 a.m. Please note, your insurance will cover 80% of the surgical costs. Your patient responsibility is $7,100. Payment in full is required at least 2 weeks prior to surgery. Sincerely, Benton County Orthopedics. Grace's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the number on her phone, $7,100, a figure as stark as the white walls of the hospital's pre-op unit. She could almost see the surgical instruments lined up on trays, hear the soft whoosh of oxygen masks. Her chest felt hollow. The fund she'd scraped together, $12,000 after months of scrimping, was now depleted by Trevor's unauthorized charges. His Bahamas getaway had swallowed nearly $4,800, leaving her surgery fund with barely enough to cover the deductible. The unspent balance stood at roughly $3,200, far short of what she now owed. Grace closed her eyes, the memory of every penny saved flickering through her mind. The $200 from selling her late mother's cookbook collection. Each $50 birthday check tucked into the new hip envelope. The extra shifts at the bookstore she picked up last winter. All gone, diverted into plane tickets and cocktail umbrellas. She opened the drawer beneath the counter, withdrew her wallet, and counted the cash she always kept for emergencies. $120. Not nearly enough. A cold wave of panic washed over her as scenarios raced through her mind, delaying surgery, risking further damage to her hip, more pain, a tougher recovery, borrowing money from friends, something she'd vowed never to do, a payday loan with its crippling interest. Grace sank into a kitchen chair and cradled her head. The breathe magnet on the fridge glowed mockingly in her peripheral vision. She inhaled deeply, just as she had during her crisis last week, each breath a lifeline. Then her gaze settled on the hip surgery folder clipped to the fridge door. The stack of medical instructions, the pre-op checklist, the half-used appointment reminder. Each page represented a first step toward walking pain-free once more. She closed her eyes and made a decision. No matter how steep the climb, she would find the means to cover those $7,100. She owed it to herself and to everyone who believed in her. Grace stood, straightening her back despite the ache in her hip. She opened her laptop and began drafting emails to her financial planner, to the clinic's billing office, even to the local women's civic group she volunteered with. She would negotiate payment terms, seek assistance, and, if necessary, organize a community fundraiser. Her fingers flew over the keyboard as she typed. Dear Mrs. Peterson, I am writing to request a payment plan for my upcoming surgery. Outside, a late summer breeze stirred the lace curtains, as if urging her forward. Grace paused and pressed her palms to the keyboard, closing her eyes once more. She whispered into the quiet kitchen, One way or another, I will not lose this chance. And with that vow, she began her next chapter, not as the woman cheated out of her savings, but as the woman who refused to surrender her future. Grace's fingers hovered over the send button on her email to the billing office when a soft knock sounded at the kitchen door. She wiped her hands on her jeans, set aside the laptop, and opened the door to find her next-door neighbor, Ellen Winthrop, standing on the threshold with a concerned frown. Ellen held a shopping bag of freshly baked cinnamon rolls, Ellen's weekend specialty, and wore her usual pearl earrings and a cardigan in hopeful yellow. Grace, honey, I just saw your name on the Benton County Orthopedics cancellation list. Grace's heart lurched. The hospital must have flagged her missed payment deadline. I wasn't sure what to do, she admitted, gesturing her inside. Ellen crossed into the kitchen and placed the bag on the counter. Why didn't you say anything? Grace looked away, cheeks warming. I didn't want to burden anyone. Ellen shook her head firmly, retrieving the sticky note from her bag. I've been your neighbor for 10 years. We've shared casseroles, carpool favors, and holiday pies. You are not a burden. She tore off the pad's top page and pressed it to the fridge beside the breathe magnet. In neat script, she wrote, Community Hip Fundraiser. Saturday at 10 a.m., Grace blinked. Ellen smiled gently. I talked to Mrs. Philbrook and she's baking her pot roast. Pastor Lewis offered the church hall for a bake sale. I put your name on the community events board. No more cancellation. Grace swallowed hard, overwhelmed by emotion. Ellen reached out and squeezed her hand. Years ago, when you nursed me after my knee replacement, you never asked for anything in return. This time, your family is the neighborhood. Across town, word had spread in casual conversation over dog walks at the post office during morning coffee about Grace's fundraiser. By evening, the church hall would be stocked with pot roast, casseroles, pies, and dozens of dollar pledges. People offered to donate gift baskets, silent auction items, even raffle tickets. Grace watched Ellen leave, the fridge now sporting the bright note of community solidarity. Tears pricked her eyes as she closed the door. She pressed her palm against the sticky note, a lifeline woven by friendships cultivated over years. That night, she drafted thank you notes, her heart swelling with gratitude. The neighborhood, her real family, had rallied without fanfare. The same streets that echoed her son's entitlement now sounded with far kinder footsteps. As she finished her emails, Grace realized she wasn't alone in this battle. With every pledged casserole and every dollar raised, her surgery fund was being replenished, not by a faceless loan or an anonymous charity, but by the hands and hearts of those who truly saw her. In the soft glow of her kitchen, surrounded by neighbors' support, Grace felt hope take root. Breathe indeed. And now, with the promise of real help, she could breathe freely once more. 2 days later, just after dawn, a firm knock sounded at Grace's front door. She was in her bathrobe, watering a small potted lavender plant on the porch. Mom, it's me, Trevor's voice called through the glass. Grace set down the watering can and opened the door to find him standing on the top step, eyes red and weary. He held a crumpled envelope, her surgery fund card, returned by mail, untouched. Mom, he began, throat tight, I know I screwed up. But we're family. Can't we move past this? Grace studied him in the soft morning light, the same boy she'd carried to his first bike ride, now grown but still learning boundaries. She let the envelope slip from his fingers to the floor and remained silent, her expression unreadable. Trevor took a tentative step forward. I've been talking to Ellen and Mrs. Philbrook. Everyone wants to help you. We can pay back the money together through the fundraiser. Grace folded her arms. You used my health fund on a whim, she said quietly. I trusted you to respect what I was saving. You violated that trust. He winced. I know, I'm sorry. She lifted a hand to forestall him. Apology isn't enough. Trevor's shoulders sagged. Then what do you want from me? Grace let the question hang in the air, watching his face for understanding. Finally, she said, I want you to learn that my needs aren't optional. My health isn't a convenience you get to borrow. That lesson isn't erased by an apology. Trevor's eyes brimmed. So what do I do? She met his gaze steadily. You honor the boundaries I set. You let me own my choices without interference. If you can't do that, then nothing changes. He swallowed hard, nodding slowly. I understand. Grace turned and walked past him into the kitchen, her robe brushing the door frame. Without looking back, she said, "Good. Now go home." Trevor lingered on the porch for a long second, then turned and descended the steps, his footsteps soft on the wood. He didn't slam the door. He closed it gently, as if sealing a chapter of his own reckoning. Inside, Grace closed the door behind her and leaned against it, breathing out the weight of what had just passed between them. She pressed her palm to the wood and whispered, "That's not a request you get to make anymore." Outside, the lavender plant nodded in the breeze, boundaries drawn, lessons learned, respect reclaimed. Grace lay in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, the soft hum of the HVAC unit the only companion to her restless thoughts. Beside her, Frank's steady breathing came through the darkness, but tonight it was uneven, matching her own tension. She turned, her hand reaching out in the dark until it found his. "Frank," she whispered, voice trembling, "what if I don't wake up tomorrow?" He shifted to face her, moonlight outlining the kindness in his eyes. His other hand found her shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Grace," he said softly, "look at me." She blinked until his face came into focus. "Then you'll go knowing you finally chose you." Grace swallowed back a sob. For weeks, she'd put everyone else first, Trevor's mistakes, her neighbor's needs, even his own, before her own health. But now, on the eve of surgery, she realized how radical it was to truly choose herself. She squeezed his hand. "I'm scared." Frank brushed a lock of hair from her forehead. "I know. But tomorrow, when you're waking up in a new hip, you'll have given yourself a gift decades in the making." She let the truth of that settle in her chest like warm embers. "A gift I almost let him steal." "Not on my watch," Frank murmured. He cupped her face, his thumb traveling over a faint silver line where surgery had opened him years ago. "You're stronger than you think." Grace closed her eyes, letting his words anchor her fear. "Promise me something." Frank leaned in. "Anything. That after this I can continue to choose me without guilt." He kissed her forehead. "I promise, always." She lay back, heart quieter now. In the hush before dawn, she felt for the first time not like someone who survived by giving, but someone who would thrive by giving to herself. Her grip on Frank's hand loosened as exhaustion washed over her. "Thank you," she whispered. He kissed her fingers. "I love you." "I love you too," she breathed, drifting towards sleep, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow she would wake for herself. Grace's eyelids felt impossibly heavy as the fluorescent OR lights glowed above her. The antiseptic scent of the operating room filled her nostrils. She lay on the narrow table, her hospital gown rustling, as a nurse adjusted her IV line. "Mrs. Whitaker." Dr. Nguyen's calm voice floated in from above her. "Ready to count us down?" Grace nodded once, mouth dry. Beneath the drape, she felt the soft pressure of the blood pressure cuff around her arm and the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. The anesthesiologist leaned close. "Take a deep breath for me, Grace." He held a mask over her face, and she inhaled the sweet chemical scent of the gas. 10. Dr. Nguyen's voice counted down, muffled through the fog. 9. The nurse's pen moved quietly across a chart. 8. Grace's eyelids fluttered, each blink slower than the last. 7. The soft hiss of the ventilator began to match her fading breaths. 6. The world dimmed to a soft gray. 5. She felt Frank's hand, warm and reassuring, in hers one last time. 4. A gentle tug as the incision began. 3. The fear that had clenched her heart loosened into nothingness. 2. Her last conscious thought was the word she'd held on to all these months. Breathe. 1. 0. Fade to black. On the third post-operative morning, Grace awoke to a chorus of beeps and the warm morning light filtering through the hospital curtains. Her body felt as though it had been cradled in ice overnight, every fiber stiff, every nerve sensitized. The sharp twinge in her new hip made her inhale sharply. But somewhere beneath the ache, she felt a spark of something brighter. She rose on one arm, testing her strength. The world tilted, and she caught her breath, then pressed her other hand into the mattress and slowly sat up. The nurse bustled in, eyes bright behind her mask. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitaker. You're sitting up already?" Grace nodded, careful not to twist her torso. "Yes, it's time." With the physical therapist waiting just outside, Grace swung her legs over the side of the bed. Each motion sent a burst of signal through her hip, like a chorus of tiny bells. She gripped the bed rail and took a deep breath. A moment later, she was standing, first on trembling legs, then with a firmer posture. The four poles clattered behind her, but she held herself straight. The pain was a razor's edge in her thigh, but her spirit soared higher. Tears shimmered in her eyes as she met the therapist's encouraging gaze. "You see? You can do this," the therapist said softly. Grace managed a shaky smile. One step at a time. She took her first measured stride, her feet sliding into the non-slip socks. Each step was an affirmation. She could stand on her own her own life, and claim her place in the world, no longer bending under others' demands. Later, nestled back in bed, she pressed her fingertips to her hip. Where once there was pain, there was now possibility. The sharpness of her incision was real, but the pride in her heart was even sharper. She closed her eyes and whispered, "I'm upright, finally upright." In that hospital room, alone and standing, Grace felt the freedom of every breath she drew. Back in her quiet Maplewood bungalow 2 weeks after surgery, Grace sat at her little oak desk by the window. The lavender she'd planted outside had sprouted tiny purple buds, nodding in the morning breeze. Sunlight warmed the desk's surface and illuminated a single sheet of stationery she'd pulled from its box. With a steady pen, she began to write. "Dear Trevor, by now your trip has come and gone, forever beyond my reach. You didn't steal my money. You freed me from an illusion. For years, I believed that sacrifice without complaint was a virtue. I thought my role was to be endlessly available, to set aside every need, to exist primarily as provider and caregiver. But when you pulled those funds from my account, you broke the spell. You reminded me there is no nobility in self-erasure. I chose to reclaim my worth, and in doing so, I chose myself. I hope you learned." Late afternoon sun warmed the knees of Grace Whitaker's jeans as she rolled her walker onto the cracked cement path leading to her old garden. The raised beds, once lush with roses, herbs, and late summer blooms, now lay parched and overrun with stubborn weeds. Grace paused, gripping the walker's handles and breathing in the faint scent of earth warmed by the sun. She planted her feet, then lowered herself gently onto the padded seat of the walker's folding perch. Each movement was deliberate, a rehearsal in patience that mirrored her months of recovery. Beside her, a small tote held gardening gloves, a trowel, and a stack of seed packets. She donned her gloves and set the tote on the path. Leaning forward, she grasped a knot of dandelions at the base, wincing as she tugged, their taproots clinging stubbornly to the dry soil. One by one, she coaxed the weeds free, exhaling each time they loosened. She laid each root aside in a neat pile, her breathing steady. Grace's hands moved with renewed purpose, each pull clearing space for the life she planned to cultivate. As she worked, memories surfaced, her daughter's laughter while they planted marigolds here, her late husband's careful coaxing of tomato seedlings just 6 months before his accident. the long afternoons she'd spent tending to each bloom. That garden had held her in seasons of joy and sorrow alike. Now, as she cleared the final patch of ground, Grace reached for the seed packets. She sprinkled thyme and lavender seeds along the edge of a new bed, then pressed them into the soil with her gloved fingertips. The air filled with the faint aroma of herbs meeting earth, a promise of fragrance yet to come. After the seeds, she planted 6 small lavender starters, spacing them evenly where the weeds had been worst. Each plant found its new home in the cleared soil, their silvery leaves glinting in the late sun. Grace stood and leaned on her walker, surveying the tidy rows. The garden looked different, no longer wild and untamed, but organized and intentional. She felt the ache in her hips as a reminder this simple act of planting was the first physical step she'd taken since surgery. A gentle breeze stirred the seedlings. Grace closed her eyes and took a deep breath, tasting the promise of new growth. She whispered to the garden, "Welcome home." With the weeds pulled and seeds sown, Grace returned her tools to the tote and wheeled herself down the path, leaving behind a garden ready for its next season. Each root removed, each seed planted, was a testament to her journey, one weed and one bloom at a time. The earth was dry now, but soon it would yield to her care. And in that transformation, as in her own, Grace would flourish again. That evening, the autumn dusk settled over Maplewood, draping Grace's bungalow in soft shadows. Inside, the kitchen light glowed, warmly resting on the worn linoleum floor and the oak table where Grace often sorted seed packets. Her phone lay face down beside a small vase of lavender cuttings. Grace had grown accustomed to the quiet. No sudden rings, no demands. Suddenly, the phone buzzed, illuminating the dark screen. Trevor Whitaker flashed across it. Grace took a breath but did not turn the device over. It buzzed again a few moments later. Finally, a soft beep indicated a voicemail. Grace continued washing the dinner dishes, soap suds fizzing in the sink. She scrubbed a plate and set it on the drying rack, its quiet rhythm matching the tumble of thoughts in her mind. She pushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear and let the phone rest unmoved on the table. The muted hum of her kitchen faucet was a kinder sound than Trevor's repeated pleas. Later, after drying her hands, Grace approached the phone. The light still glowed, indicating one unheard voicemail. She pressed play. Trevor's voicemail, 3:22 p.m. "Mom, it's me. I just want to talk. I know I messed up. I'd like the chance to apologize face to face. Please call me back when you're ready." Grace listened to the message a second time. She felt the pull of her heart, his sincere tone, the tremor in his voice. Yet she remained unmoved. She ended the playback and let the phone fall back down, screen still dark. Her son wanted to talk, but some calls are meant to echo unanswered. She turned away, stepping into the living room where a soft armchair waited. Outside, the last rays of sunset dipped below the horizon. Grace picked up a book and opened to the next chapter, the quiet turning of pages replacing Trevor's unanswered plea. In the hush of her home, Grace chose the silence she needed, protecting her peace, honoring her boundaries, and standing firm in the knowledge that healing sometimes requires letting rings go unanswered. The next morning, Grace stepped out into the crisp Maplewood air, wrapped in her favorite shawl. The sun painted the sky in pale pinks and gold, and a gentle breeze teased loose strands of silver hair around her face. As she made her way down the front walk, her eyes fell on the mailbox, freshly painted berry red, its surface gleaming in the dawn light. Where once a small brass plaque read, "Trevor Whitaker and Family," the letters were gone. In their place, a simple metal script had been affixed. G. Whitmore, Whitmore, her maiden name, bold and clear against the red paint. Grace's breath caught No longer Trevor's mom, no longer Caleb's grandma, no longer defined by anyone else's story. This mailbox bore only her own name, her own identity. She reached out and ran a fingertip along the G, smiling as the cool metal met her skin. A powerful reassurance hummed through her veins. She had found her way home to herself. Behind her, the lavender-lined path swayed softly, buds nodding in approval. The house next door, now fully restored, stood silent but watched, no longer her battlefield, but a chapter closed. Across the lane, morning light danced on 218 Hawthorne Lane's porch, where she had once sat, planning her stand. Now her garden thrived anew, and her own porch held the promise of fresh beginnings. Grace turned her gaze back to her yard, inhaling deeply. The brittle echoes of past betrayals, misused funds, broken promises, slammed doors fell away on the breeze. In their place rose a clear, ringing peace. She posted the mail slot open, dropped the first letter inside, an invitation to neighbors for Sunday's harvest tea, and closed it with a soft click. Then she stepped back and folded her arms, letting the morning sun warm her face. A robin alighted on the fence post, its bright song greeting her as if to say, "Welcome back." Grace Whitmore closed her eyes, savoring that moment. She was upright, physically and emotionally, rooted in her own name. And as she opened her eyes, she knew this was the first day of truly living for herself. With a contented sigh, she whispered into the new day, "I'm home."